All right. Just kind of wanted to start out a little bit. Just thank everybody involved, like in the draft process. It's been a really good process. A lot of good collaboration, communication between everybody. And I feel like that's what you need to get to the right answers and get to the final conclusion on some guys. So still some work to do, but we're making a lot of progress. We feel good about where we're at right now. Excited to get the next Thursday. Big first round pick. We got the 8th overall pick. Excited to just continue building and adding competition to the roster, adding talent to the roster, and we're going to be able to introduce our first round pick next Friday. Keep pounding drum and just kind of introduce them to the fans and everybody kind of get to know them a little bit. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
That suggests, Dan, that you're definitely going to pick in the first round.
Yeah, we're going to be there.
How comfortable would you be in a potential trade back scenario? And I guess, in other words, where do you see the ledge of first round talent falling?
I don't really want to get into specifics on like where I would trade back to, but I think we're definitely open to trading back and acquiring more picks. I think we're going to be open, to all possibilities. Let's put it that way.
And there seems to be consensus that the front seven talent in this draft is pretty stacked. With that said, how much do you have to weigh that, as much as you guys have invested in it and want to invest in it further, when you consider a potential trade back opportunity?
Yeah, repeat that again. So
essentially, with the strength of this class and understanding that is something that you guys have kind of been strategic about, how much do you have to understand the strengths of this class when considering a trade back?
Yeah, I think obviously, we'll count numbers and, in terms of outside backers and interior guys, it's definitely a strong class, which we're excited about because, I think that's still an emphasis that we want to address is, just make our front seven as strong as it can be. So we'll look at all in every scenario, but yeah, we'll definitely look into that.
As far as Icky's fifth-year option, I believe the due date's May 1st. Keeping your options open with that heading into the draft, does that kind of complicate the way you maybe look at the offensive tackle position in this?
No, I don't think it does. I mean, we're just taking our time with that. There's no rush. We still have to, I think it's May 2nd. So we're not rushing that. We're taking our time, and we'll have a plan in place.
Dan, when there are players that maybe don't have the numbers or production in college that really stand out off the page, does that turn you away at all? And how do you kind of bake that into your evaluation?
I think obviously you want the production, you want the body of work to be there. You obviously don't want to draft guys that, weren't productive in college. So I think that's kind of what you're asking, right? So, yeah, we're not, obviously we want, guys with a lot of production, and I think that usually translates to the next level.
Dan, based on everything you did so far, how committed are you to sticking to defense with number 8 or trading back in that position?
Yeah, I think I said it before. Like, we're not going to box ourselves in. We're going to be open to all possibilities. With that number 8 pick. Like I said, whether it's trading back or whether it's staying there and picking somebody. So we're definitely not going to box ourselves in.
Dan, with what you've gone through last year in building the roster and addressing certain areas and doing it again in free agency this year, setting up for the draft, I know you speak in a collective we, like how it's coming together, but from the general manager's position, how are you liking how do you feel about where this group is and what you can do? Is it taking the image that you had that you envisioned?
Yeah, I feel really good about where we're at right now. Excited about the direction that we're heading. I feel like we can really add some good pieces to the roster and continue to add to the front and build out that depth and the competition on both sides of the ball with both fronts. So I think we want to dominate the line of scrimmage, and I think that's the bottom line.
Is the general manager ever fully satisfied with the work that they've done?
No, I mean, I don't think, I think no matter how good this roster can ever get, like, you can never be satisfied. You always got to be hungry and always looking for ways to be innovative and getting better.
Dan, at the owners' meetings, Dave said that he was really happy with the wide receiver room led by Xavier Legette. Curious to know your take on the Panthers wide receiver room now and how that kind of aligns with this wide receiver draft class.
Yeah, I agree with what Dave said. We're excited about the development of, Xavier and Jalen Coker and some of our young guys. So, with Thielen still in there, Reeson and David Moore, I think we do feel good about our receiver room. I think, we're looking forward to seeing them compete and just get better and better. And, that's not to say that we're not going to, invest in a receiver at some point during the draft. So we're just going to draft really good football players. And if it's a wideout, then, so be it.
Given that Taylor's going into a contract year, is offensive tackle on the table for you guys?
Again, like, we're not going to box ourselves in with anything. I think, if an offensive tackle's there at some point, like, I'd be open to drafting an offensive tackle, but that, really doesn't have anything to do with Taylor Moton.
And when the Saints news came out Friday, did that kind of cause a little uptick in traffic on your phone? I mean, were more people interested in talking once that's out there?
No, I don't think yet. I think it's still a little early for that. I think maybe down the line I'll expect it a little more, but right now things are quiet.
Jason Light said last week, Dan, that he thinks it's going to be less movement this year because sort of a level type talent level across the later first round into the second. Do you get that same vibe that it might be tough to find a trade up partner?
I always look at it like it only takes one team to fall in love with a player, so, a team could fall in love with a player and decide they want to trade up with us and go get their guy. So, I really don't look at it like that. I just look at it as, a team's just may really love a guy. So we'll be waiting if somebody wants to come up.
And a lot's made of 30 visits. What is your philosophy towards 30 visits as a franchise? It seems like everybody has their own thing, but what specifically for you is?
I think we usually bring in guys that we just kind of feel like we want to get to know a little bit better, whether it's from a personal standpoint or from like a football standpoint, whether it's, getting them on the board one more time and, just checking their mental, their IQ, and then just kind of getting to know them as, people. So I think as much time as you can spend with these guys, it's good in the end.
You guys signed Colin Granger. What went behind the decision to, bring in a guy who has limited to no football?
Yeah, I think, it's a good opportunity to fill out our 90-man roster. Colin had a good workout. He was recommended by George Fan, who we're familiar with from our Seattle days. It's just an opportunity just to add a guy and, be open-minded and then just kind of try some new things, and maybe see what we have.
Dan, it seems like every mock draft has you taking Jalen Walker. At the combine, I believe you weren't really wanting to commit to how you saw him fitting into your system.
Right.
Can you expand on that a little bit on how you see him fitting in if you were to take him?
I mean, Jalen's a good player. I think, for us, I guess I'll talk on it now, but he's an outside linebacker for us that I feel like can do a lot in our defense. I think he's definitely a great person, really good player, and, I think he's got a bright future ahead.
And kind of building off that, he's a hybrid sort of player. Like you mentioned, he's going to be this guy for us, not necessarily meaning that he would be this guy for other teams. What's your view on defensive players, and particularly defensive front seven guys who can play multiple positions? Like, does that make him more attractive as a draft prospect?
I don't know if it makes them more attractive, but I think it definitely makes them, it adds value to them. I think, in Jalen's case, he can play on the outside. You can move him inside. You can do a lot of different things with him on the defense. And, I know that we do value those type of things. And again, he's a good player.
Is there a concern with a player like that you might spread him too thin if you do try to, off the bat, find multiple roles for him?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. I think, it's always good to align a guy where you really want to play him so he can, develop in a specific place. That way you're not moving him around and he's not really getting better or getting great at anything. He's just kind of good at, a bunch of different things. So, yeah, I definitely think that's valid.
To his sort of character and football IQ, I know he's the son of a longtime college coach. Did that come through in your meetings with him?
Yeah. Again, he's a great kid. He's super smart. I mean, he's been around football his whole life. So, I think he's everything that you would expect.
Dan, now that you've been through this process twice with Canales, how would you describe the conversations about prospects that you and he have?
Yeah, I think there's honest conversations. We're not afraid to challenge each other. And that doesn't go just for me and Coach Canales. That goes for myself and, our whole staff. I challenge our staff I want them to challenge me. I think it needs to be that type of room. I think as long as you're getting to the final answer that's, going to give us the best player and come to the best solution, then that's what you have to do.
With y'all's backgrounds, is it hard for him to kind of separate being an old receivers coach, offensive guy, versus you being a former linebacker when you're looking at prospects?
No, I think we both do a good job of separating ourselves from that. I think we're really just looking what is going to make our team the best team. And, which player that we add to our roster is going to make a bigger difference. So that's the way we look at everything.
If you get into a situation where the board falls a certain way, and obviously, consensus is what it is outside of that, and you can't move out of the pick, do you feel comfortable taking, a guy who might be viewed as maybe a bit of a reach in other years?
Yeah, listen, at number 8, if we get stuck there and we're not able to trade back, if we're not in love with the player there at number 8 and we can't trade back, then we're going to be ready for all different types of scenarios. So there's some really good players that we like. It's just not one position. But we feel like it's a good draft and there's a lot of talent. So we're going to be ready for all scenarios.
You use an expression like if we get stuck there, that would seem to suggest your preference would be to move back.
No, I was just saying if we do get stuck, we're going to be ready, for all different scenarios, because we don't know who's going to be drafted in those top 7. So, again, we're going to be ready for all different scenarios.
A scenario where your preference would be to move back? Depending on what happens to the 7 in front of you?
Yeah, I think we got to really just kind of see how the board plays out, and, I think we're going to know what to do once we get there.
How many different scenarios have you kind of mapped out?
There's a lot of different scenarios. Again, you don't know who's going to be taken in those first 7 picks, so we have to be prepared for all different scenarios, and we're going to be ready.
Is 8 perhaps a challenging spot? You don't want to be number 1 because of the year before, but 8 to 15, is that kind of a wasteland area? Or
no, I think it's a good spot. I think we're going to be able to get a really good pick. If we choose to stay there, and again, if we trade back, I think we're going to be able to get a really good player there too. So, I think this draft is a good draft that we're excited about.
Last year, you guys were pretty aggressive in trading all around the board. You don't pick from, in between 9 and 56, so that's a pretty long gap. How much has the discussion revolved around potentially making sure that gap is kind of closed?
Yeah, we've went through all different scenarios at this point, and that's of course going to be one of them as well. So we're definitely playing out all different scenarios in our head, and I think when the time comes and we see who's on the board, we're going to be ready to go.
Dan, when do the calls ramp up, really, in terms of trades and that kind of stuff? And last year, when you were talking to Brandon about going up maybe to get XL, when did that process start?
That started really the night of the draft. Obviously, the week of the draft, you make your calls and, you talk to people about, hey, we'd be willing to move out of this spot. What are your plans, with your pick? So I think it's a communication thing throughout the week with other GMs and other personnel people around the league. And then once it gets to draft night, if you do choose to move up and, a team like Buffalo was willing to trade out of that pick, we knew that. So we could go up and we could get Xavier. So
Do you have to come out of this draft with a safety?
yeah, I think safety is definitely an area that we'd like to address. But again, it would be nice to get one. But I don't think we can. I don't think we should force it either. I talked about before just getting the best available football players. So if it happens to be a safety, then so be it. But I also don't think we should just force anything.
And did your activity during the free agency period affect severely what you plan to do in this draft? And then vice versa, will the draft affect what you plan to do going forward in the free agency?
Yeah, I think what we did in free agency, obviously addressing the front, I think it eases the tension up a little bit, from having to, go reach or having to go, grab a defensive lineman. So I think it definitely helps out. But again, at the same time, we're always going to draft best available player. And, it's not going to change this draft.
When you've talked to Dave about scheme, I know you guys are encouraged by the wide receiver group. That's what you said. Have you thought about a tight end potentially adding the element of that number one wide receiver, that number two wide receiver in this draft because the group is so good?
Yeah, I think, talked about it before, just about adding playmakers, on both sides of the ball. And, a tight end can be a playmaker as well. So, I think all options will be on the table in terms of position.
Do you think the tight end group is deeper, maybe say 1 through 4, first through fourth round, than the wide receiver group?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. I think in the first 3 rounds, I think you'll get, some good wide receivers and some good tight ends. So I do think it drops off at a certain point. So, you have to be strategic.
Do you think the tight end group is a little deeper?
No, I wouldn't say that.
I had asked.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say that. Yeah.
When you're scouting kickers, who do you rely on for that? Like Tracy or, maybe specialists outside of the building? How does that work?
It's usually the special teams coach, him and his staff, they'll really evaluate those guys, and I'll lean heavily on them.
When you're scouting your guys for specific player position groups, do you put any emphasis on familiarity the players would have had by playing at the same college program or at a different program in their time frame?
No, I don't think so. I think we just, again, we don't really have that play. That stuff really doesn't come into consideration. It's just about drafting the best football players.
Dan, you've had a couple of months now since the end of the season to kind of evaluate and look back and think things over. How critical was that finishing stretch from what the team put forth last season to how you approached free agency and now how you're approaching this draft? Did you get questions answered? Do you feel like you have a better, baseline for where this team is?
Yeah, I think, the way we ended the season, obviously a lot of positive momentum going into the next year. And, I think everybody's excited in the building. I think the fans are excited. So it really draws a lot of excitement for us to go and continue to add, really good players to our roster. And so it can make us one of the more competitive teams in the NFL. So it's just another step to where we want to go.
And personnel questions were answered for you, to go out and do what you did in free agency and going forward?
Yeah, I feel really good about what we did in free agency, just adding to our front and, adding a safety like Morig. We added some good players that we're really excited about, and we're headed in a good direction.
Dan, when a guy plays at multiple schools, how does that factor into your evaluation?
Say that again?
When a guy plays at multiple schools, transfers around a little bit, how does that kind of play into your evaluation of that guy?
It really doesn't. I don't really. Nowadays, it's so common that, I try not to really ding those guys for, moving multiple times. Maybe back, 5-6 years ago, you know, it might be a little different, but right now I really don't, it doesn't come into play.
And the adage is scout the player, not the helmet. But there are certain systems in college that seem to not translate as easily to the NFL, and then those guys take a couple of years, but then they kind of blossom because they have the trades. How much do you weigh that when you guys are evaluating specifically defensive players?
So you're saying,
Like Georgia is known for having guys that have a lot of talent that come out and it takes a couple of years and then they kind of excel.
right?
But they're not the only college program that does that. When you're looking at guys like that coming from those programs, does that answer any questions about maybe what they can do versus can't do, vice versa?
I mean, I think it makes it a little easier, you know, the level of competition that, you know, certain teams play against. Obviously, you know, a school like Georgia, they're playing against top competition in the SEC. So I think from an evaluation standpoint, it does make it a little easier.